The 12-hour shift at Seattle General began the way Elena Martinez's shifts always began, with invisibility. She moved through the emergency department's controlled chaos like water finding its path around stones, present but unremarkable, her scrubs the same faded blue as a dozen other nurses threading between trauma bays and patient rooms. The fluorescent lights hummed their metallic song overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made 3 a.m. feel like it was always 3 a.m. Antiseptic mingled with old coffee in the recycled air, a smell so familiar it had stopped registering as a smell at all. Her daughter Sophia had texted 40 minutes before shift start, "Mom, pick me up 8. Coach says maybe varsity next year." Elena had replied with a thumbs-up emoji even though she wouldn't know until the final patient was stabilized whether 8 o'clock would be 7:41 or 9:15. This was the math of emergency nursing, the precise, measureless arithmetic of other people's crises. She was restocking the crash cart in Trauma Bay 3 when her left ear caught the distant sound of helicopter rotors passing over the city. Not landing, just passing. Her hand moved to the scar tissue behind her left ear unconsciously, the way it always did, her fingers finding the ridge of healed skin like a familiar landmark. Tikrit. Always Tikrit, even when it was just a helicopter moving a patient from one hospital to another on a Tuesday morning in San Diego. She breathed once, let the hand drop, and returned to her count: epinephrine, atropine, lidocaine, amiodarone. The crash cart was a liturgy she could perform in darkness. The 14-gauge angiocath needles went into their slots with precise clicks. Airway equipment in ascending order. The systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned that disorganization killed people. Other nurses sometimes watched her work and wondered where she'd trained, not the usual nursing program path, they'd say to each other. Too competent. Too calm under pressure. Too comfortable with protocols that made experienced nurses sweat. Elena never answered their questions. The past was a country she'd decided not to visit anymore. She was 23 years old when she signed the papers at Camp Lejeune. 36 now. 13 years of service compressed into silence and a faded photograph that stayed in her locker, never discussed. The unit patch was sewn inside the lining of her jacket, 2nd Battalion, thread still holding it despite years of washing. A talisman she carried the way other people carried crosses. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody needed to know. The ER filled its usual Tuesday morning inventory: a construction worker with a lacerated hand, an elderly woman complaining of chest pressure that turned out to be anxiety, a 20-something male who'd taken something he couldn't remember the name of and was having second thoughts about that decision. Standard. Manageable. Elena moved between rooms like she'd done it 1,000 times because she had done it 1,000 times, and before that she'd moved between situations that made emergency room crises look like dress rehearsals. It was during the shift change, 6:27 a.m., the light outside not quite morning yet, that particular shade of grey that happens when night hasn't fully admitted defeat, when the power flicker happened. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Enough for half the monitors to lose their signal and for the backup generators to kick in with that metallic groan they always made. Most of the nursing staff paused. One of the junior nurses, a kid named Marcus who was 6 weeks into his first ER rotation, actually stepped back from the patient he was assisting. Elena didn't pause. She was already moving toward a patient in Bay 4 who needed a second full line for fluid resuscitation, and the darkness didn't change her trajectory by a millimeter. Her hands moved with movements that muscle memory had preserved from different circumstances, from training conducted in the actual absence of light, not the theoretical darkness of a 3-second power failure. The catheter found the vein without hesitation. The tourniquet came off. The saline drip established smooth and steady while the fluorescent lights hummed back to life and the monitors resumed their beeping like nothing had happened. She needed some jello after that. That was the thought that moved through her head with dry precision as she finished documenting the 4 placement, the time, the gauge, the location, the patient response. Jello. Maybe the orange kind. She'd learned years ago that dark humor was the only kind that kept you sane when you spent 12 hours at a time watching people's lives become statistics and sometimes learning that the statistics moved the wrong direction. Dr. Richard Ashford arrived 15 minutes after the power came back. He moved through the emergency department with the particular confidence of a man who had never been required to question his own authority. His white coat was still crisp at 7 in the morning. His shoes were polished to the kind of shine that suggested someone else maintained them. He carried himself the way a man carries a title that's been validated by every structure surrounding him, hospital boards, peer reviews, a salary that reflected his position at the apex of the hierarchy. He was tall, angular, the kind of handsome that hardened into something else when you watched him long enough. Authority had a smell. Authority had a shape. He wore it like other people wore cologne. His eyes moved across the ER staff with the calculation of someone conducting an inventory, this one competent, that one adequate, this one struggling. His gaze landed on Elena and held there for exactly the amount of time it took him to note the slight limp in her gait as she moved toward the patient in Bay 2. Her left knee favored a degree of weight distribution that wasn't quite perfect, a fraction of compensation that had become so automatic she'd stopped noticing it in mirrors. He saw that. He saw it, and the calculation happened behind his eyes, and then he moved on, because a limp meant less, not more. A limp meant something was wrong with her. That was the equation he understood. What he didn't see was the way her hands moved with surgical precision when she started D4 in that darkened room, the muscle memory of someone who had learned to work in actual darkness, in circumstances where there was no backup generator waiting to kick in. He didn't see the photograph in her locker, a platoon of Marines in Tikrit, 2011, their faces burned dark by desert sun, 2 of them circled in black pen and never quite explained. He didn't see the way she touched the scar behind her left ear when aircraft passed overhead. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining where it would never be visible, never be questioned, never be anything but what it was, a small piece of who she used to be, carried into a life where nobody asked and she'd learned not to tell. She'd chosen invisibility deliberately. Carefully. The way soldiers chose camouflage. The morning deepened into the rhythm of routine emergencies. The construction worker's hand got 10 stitches and some standard wound care instructions he probably wouldn't follow. The elderly woman was discharged with a referral to cardiology and pamphlets about stress management that she tucked under her arm without reading. The drug-addled 20-something was admitted for observation and felt genuinely grateful, which was the saddest part of Elena's job, the gratitude for basic medical intervention, the relief on faces that had learned to expect so little. Elena was back at the crash cart, restocking what had been used, the inventory ongoing and automatic. Around her, the ER staff moved in their own patterns, some of them fresh and clicking into their shifts, others winding down toward the end of their 12 hours and starting to think about coffee and beds and whether they'd left the stove on at home. Junior nurses gave her a wide berth of respect that was slightly too formal. Senior nurses treated her with the kind of distance people maintain toward competence they don't fully understand. Dr. Ashford was in the break room at 8:33 a.m. when Elena came in briefly to check the schedule. He was reviewing something on the hospital's computer system, his jaw set in concentration that shifted to irritation when she entered. He didn't acknowledge her presence directly. He simply continued what he was doing while she filled a cup of water from the cooler and stood waiting for the schedule board to load. It was a performance of contempt that was subtle enough to be undeniable and obvious enough to make the point. The nursing staff could increase their efficiency, he said to nobody in particular, his eyes still on the computer screen, if they spent less time getting underfoot and more time understanding the actual chain of command. This isn't a collective. It's a hierarchy for a reason. Elena drank her water. The water was room temperature and tasted like plastic. She didn't respond because responding wasn't the point of his statement. The point was the statement itself, the reminder of the structure, the order, the understanding of who made decisions and who executed them. She finished her water, tossed the cup into the recycling bin with its empty sound of dismissal, and returned to the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that there was nowhere inside her that registered shock at it. The worst part was how normal it felt. The worst part was that she understood exactly what he was doing and why, and she had already decided in advance not to answer him back. 12 hours. That was all it was supposed to be. 12 hours and home by 8 p.m., maybe 8:15 if the evening nurse came in late, which they usually did on Tuesdays. Sophia would be at soccer practice. Elena would pick her up and they'd grab something from the drive-thru and drive back through neighborhoods that looked nothing like Tikrit, which was the entire point of being here. The entire point of invisibility. The entire point of learning to be someone who didn't matter, who moved through institutions without leaving marks, who understood that the world made room for people like her only if they never made anyone else feel small. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The shift continued its measured rhythm. Patients arrived in their own sequences, a twisted ankle, a possible appendicitis, a migraine that had lasted 4 days. Elena moved between them with that same invisible competence, restocking, stabilizing, assisting doctors who would never look her in the eye when they gave orders. The fluorescent lights continued their hum. The monitors continued their beeping. The antiseptic continued its assault on whatever other smell might want to exist in an emergency room. Her shift was measured in increments and she was counting them down. 4 hours left, 3 hours, 2.5. She didn't know that Dr. Ashford was already thinking about her. Didn't know that her competence had registered as something that needed to be managed. Didn't know that invisibility only worked if nobody paid attention, and he was the kind of man who paid very close attention to threats. She was still moving through her shift like water finding its path, present but unremarkable, when the first siren started wailing in the distance, getting louder. The siren was still wailing when the overhead page crackled to life, that particular sound of institutional contempt transmitted across 3 floors simultaneously. Lena the coffee girl, report to radiology. Lena the coffee girl, radiology needs their assistant. The words hung in the ER like a smell that wouldn't fade, and Elena felt 20 pairs of eyes pivot toward her in that synchronized way that happens when someone has been publicly named and diminished in the same breath. She was restocking the crash cart when it happened, her hand steady on the intubation kit, but her jaw tightened, a single involuntary muscle contraction that lasted maybe half a second. One measured breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way combat breathing protocols taught you to metabolize humiliation without letting it change your face. She set down the laryngoscope with the precision of someone diffusing a device rather than placing medical equipment, and moved toward radiology without hurry, without apology, without giving him the satisfaction of rushed footsteps. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical hornets, and her badge, the one with her real name, Elena Martinez, RN, not Lena the coffee girl, clattered slightly against her chest as she walked. The trauma bay receded behind her. The waiting room with its soundtrack of coughs and crying children and the muted television playing daytime medical dramas faded into background noise. She was aware of being watched, aware of the whispers that would start the moment she turned the corner, aware of exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. Dr. Ashford stood in the radiology doorway like a man who'd discovered a new form of entertainment. His white coat was pristine, the kind of pristine that came from never actually touching patients, never actually doing the work, and his smile had the quality of a predator showing its teeth. Just making sure you know your place, Martinez. His voice carried the particular cadence of a man used to authority, the kind of voice that had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Fetch me those contrast films. I assume you know what contrast is. He gestured toward the film archive with theatrical disdain, and Elena felt something crystallize inside her chest, something cold and precise. She met his eyes without blinking, without the deference that had kept her invisible for 3 months. My place is keeping patients alive, Dr. Ashford. What's yours? The words came out flat, conversational, the way you might comment on the weather, but she watched his face tighten at the edges. She'd crossed a line. She'd answered back instead of accepting the humiliation like a good nurse was supposed to do, like the institutional hierarchy demanded. She could see him recalculating, could see the moment he decided this required escalation. His jaw clenched, the same involuntary muscle contraction she'd performed, except his came with the weight of institutional power behind it. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the supply closet ambush came like a calculated strike. Elena was conducting the afternoon morphine count, cross-referencing the narcotic log against the doses withdrawn, when Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, blocking her exit with the casual certainty of a man who'd never considered that someone might want to escape from him. The supply closet was narrow, shelves on both sides, barely 6 feet long, lit by a single bulb that cast harsh shadows across his face. His breath smelled like coffee and entitlement, and he held up a printed narcotic log in one hand like evidence at a trial. "There's a discrepancy here. 10 milligrams unaccounted for on Tuesday evening during the 6 p.m. shift." His voice had dropped to something quieter than the page, more dangerous because of it. "Care to explain?" Elena scanned the log without touching it, her eyes finding the entry in 3 seconds. Tuesday. 6 p.m. shift. Except Elena hadn't worked Tuesday. She'd been off. The dates didn't match her schedule. She could see the fabrication clearly, a clumsy one, actually, the kind a competent person would have caught, which meant he was betting she wasn't paying attention, or that she'd panic, or that the accusation alone would be enough. "That shift wasn't mine," Elena said, her voice steady as surgical lighting. "I was off Tuesday. The log says otherwise." He stepped closer, using proximity as a weapon, using his height and his position in the doorway to make the space feel smaller. "This is your career, Martinez. One word from me and you're done. One word and they pull your license. You think your little nursing degree protects you? You think patient advocacy makes you immune?" His hand moved toward his pocket, and Elena understood he was reaching for his phone, reaching for the weapon of accusation, the mechanism by which he'd already decided she would be destroyed. Elena's hand trembled once. Just once. A single involuntary quiver that traveled from her wrist to her fingertips, and she felt him see it, felt him interpret it as fear, as capitulation. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the compressed force of someone who'd learned how to hold herself together under conditions that would shatter ordinary people, and she stopped it deliberately, consciously, pulling it back inside her like retracting a weapon. "If you need to threaten people in closets, doctor, you've already lost." She moved past him without touching him, moving sideways along the narrow space with the kind of body control that came from muscle memory older than most medical licenses. Her shoulder came close to brushing his, but didn't. She didn't give him the gift of that contact, didn't give him the excuse to claim she'd assaulted him. She simply existed in space adjacent to him and moved toward the door, and something in her posture, something in the way her weight shifted, made him step back enough to let her pass. She pulled the supply closet door shut behind her without looking at him, and continued her shift as though nothing had happened. But the cascade was already in motion. The visible humiliation, the one designed for witnesses, came on Friday as the evening shift arrived at 4 p.m. for their transition briefing. Elena was leaving the employee entrance, her shift nearly complete, when Dr. Ashford emerged from the hospital doors behind her. The timing wasn't accidental. The location wasn't chance. 30 feet separated the employee parking lot from the entrance, and he positioned himself directly in the path of the arriving evening crew, his voice carrying across the asphalt like a broadcast announcement. "Elena Martinez is being reassigned effective immediately. Permanent night shift for ongoing performance concerns." He said it the way a news anchor might announce a minor weather change, casual, official, final. "I think with less direct supervision she might finally learn to follow protocol." He smiled at her, a smile that was pure performance, designed for the witnesses now turning to stare. The evening crew froze mid-stride, the way people do when they witness a public execution, their eyes darting between Elena and Dr. Ashford, calculating distances, weighing alliances. A single tear escaped down Elena's cheek. Just one. Not trembling, not a sob, not visible distress, a single crystalline drop that traced down her cheekbone and fell onto the asphalt without her acknowledging it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the movement economical, clinical, the way a surgeon might wipe blood from a gloved palm, and maintained unbroken eye contact with Dr. Ashford as she did it. "If competence threatens you this much, Dr. Ashford, perhaps you're in the wrong profession." Her voice was quiet enough that only he and the nearest witnesses could hear it clearly, and she watched his smile falter for just a fraction of a second. He laughed, that practiced sound of a man accustomed to having the last word, but something flickered behind his eyes, in not anger exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The first hint that he'd identified a threat but hadn't correctly assessed its magnitude. He'd touched something in her and expected it to break, the way most things in his experience broke when pressured sufficiently. She walked to her car without rushing. Her hands didn't shake on the steering wheel. Her breathing remained controlled as she pulled out of the parking lot and merged into the late afternoon traffic on Harbor Drive. The drive home took 23 minutes. She lived in a studio apartment 3 miles from Seattle General, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors' conversations, the kind of place a person lived when they were passing through life rather than settling into it. She fed the cat, a gray tabby she'd adopted from the shelter 6 weeks ago because it reminded her of something, some quality of patient wariness, and sat on her apartment's small balcony as the sun moved toward the bay, watching the light change the way she'd learned to watch trauma vitals. The rain started at 6:02 p.m., not yet dark but close to it, the kind of San Diego evening that felt less like summer and more like something suspended between seasons. Elena's phone buzzed once. Then again. Messages from co-workers she barely knew, expressing sympathy, offering solidarity, the small gestures people made when they witnessed someone being crushed by institutional power and didn't know how to stop it. She didn't respond to any of them. She was still in her scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge, still carrying the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 2nd Battalion patch from Tikrit, from before the combat injury, from before the life she was living now. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The dispatch alert crackled through Seattle General's emergency department at 6:41 p.m., the kind of voice that made every nurse's spine straighten. Multi-vehicle collision on I-5, Priority 1 trauma inbound, ETA for minutes. The words hung in the air like a held breath, for minutes to prepare for something that could unravel in seconds. Elena was restocking the crash cart in Bay 3 when the alert sounded, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Saline bags, defibrillator pads, intubation tubes arranged in the exact sequence muscle memory demanded. Her fingers didn't hesitate. They never hesitated anymore. The adrenaline that was flooding through the ER, the sudden acceleration of pace, the organized chaos that felt like dancing to a rhythm only trauma surgeons understood, it sharpened her focus instead of clouding it. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing slowed. Every sound in the department became crisp and separate, the beeping of monitors, the squeak of gurney wheels being pulled from storage, the sharp snap of gloves being distributed. This was the part of nursing Elena had never stopped being good at. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay entrance, his white coat already pristine, his tie already perfectly centered. He was good at arrivals, at the theater of command. He began barking orders before he'd even assessed the patient. Trauma team to Bay 1, get the surgeons paged, somebody call OR and tell them we're incoming with a multi-system trauma. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Nobody questioned Dr. Ashford's emergency protocols. He'd built a reputation on being decisive, on being the kind of physician who thrived when stakes climbed and lesser minds froze. Elena had watched him work before, he was competent enough when the problem was straightforward. But she'd also watched what happened when complications arose. His competence was like a suit of armor that only worked if it fit the problem perfectly. The ambulance doors burst open at 6:51 p.m. The patient on the stretcher was a man in his mid-60s, his uniform still partially visible beneath the trauma dressings, marine dress blues, though Elena didn't register the significance of that detail yet. His face was the color of old paper. Blood saturated the left side of his chest where paramedics had applied a seal dressing, and even from 8 feet away, Elena could hear the wet, labored sound of his breathing. Not breathing correctly. Breathing like a man whose lungs were losing a war against gravity and pressure. Collapsed lung. The paramedic's voice came rapid and clipped, trauma from steering wheel impact, rib fractures on the left, decreased breath sounds across the left field, O2 sat dropping, started at 94% now down to 78% in the ambulance. The man's blood pressure was 92/58. His heart rate was 118. His skin was the texture of cold wax. They transferred him to Bay 1 in the coordinated sequence that emergency departments had perfected over decades. 1, 2, 3, lift on the count, and he was on the trauma bed, the paramedics peeling away like water, leaving him exposed under the fluorescent lights that hummed their endless mechanical song. For lines were already running. The EKG leads went on in practice movements. But the situation was already deteriorating. Elena could see it in the way the monitor's oxygen saturation numbers kept climbing down, 76%, 74%, 72%. The patient's breathing was becoming shallower. More desperate. Dr. Ashford moved to the bedside and began his assessment with the confidence of a man who'd never seriously failed at anything. Palpate the chest, his fingers found the fractured ribs, the patient gasping with pain. Listen to breath sounds, the stethoscope moved across the left lung field and came back with nothing. Silence where sound should have been. The right side was clear, but the left side was a dead zone. Elena was standing at the edge of the bay, her position neither forward nor back, her hands at her sides in the neutral stance of a nurse awaiting instruction. But her eyes were tracking the monitor. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 68%. The blood pressure was sliding toward 80. The heart rate was climbing past 130, the patient's body beginning to panic in the way bodies panic when they're not getting enough oxygen, when the blood pressure is dropping, when the lungs have essentially become useless bags of fluid. "We need cardiothoracic," Dr. Ashford said, though his voice carried a note of something Elena recognized from Tikrit. Uncertainty. Not about the diagnosis was obvious. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was pressing against the heart, restricting its ability to pump. Air trapped in the pleural space, pressure building, blood pressure falling, oxygen saturation plummeting toward the point where the brain would start dying. But uncertainty about what to do about it when your backup wasn't available. Get surgery on the line. ETA on the cardiothoracic team. 22 minutes out, the attending physician called back, a doctor Elena didn't recognize. They're coming from outside the hospital, got stuck in afternoon traffic. Fastest they can move. 22 minutes. The monitor showed O2 sat at 63% now. Heart rate 142. Blood pressure 76/40. This man did not have 22 minutes. Elena's hands felt cold. Not trembling cold. Not panic cold. The cold that came from seeing the equation clearly and understanding that the numbers didn't add up to a survival story if nothing changed in the next 90 seconds. In Tikrit, she'd faced this equation maybe a dozen times. Wounded Marines whose injuries were fixable if you acted in the window between dying and dead. That window was small. Sometimes it was 30 seconds. Sometimes it was 2 minutes. This general had maybe 3 minutes before his blood pressure dropped low enough that his brain began to suffer permanent damage. Dr. Ashford was still standing at the bedside, his jaw tight, his eyes moving between the monitor and the patient's chest. He was thinking. Planning. Waiting for backup that wasn't coming. He was competent enough, but competence at waiting wasn't the skill this moment required. "We need a needle decompression," Elena heard herself say. Her voice was quiet. Not deferential. Not asking permission. Just stating fact. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator whooshing in the next bay. Dr. Ashford's head turned toward her slowly, like a machine gearing into motion. His eyes found her across the distance of the bay, and for a moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition that she'd just challenged his authority in front of the entire trauma team. The same authority he'd spent 3 weeks dismantling, piece by piece, in supply closets and parking lots. "Excuse me." His voice was soft. The dangerous kind of soft. The kind that came before storms. "The oxygen saturation is 63, Elena said. Still quiet. Still factual. Blood pressure dropping. That's a tension pneumothorax compressing the heart. He needs immediate decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Needle thoracostomy. We do it now or he arrests in the next 2 minutes." She'd calculated it the way she'd calculated 100 scenarios in field medicine: time remaining, injury severity, intervention window. The math was brutal and clear. "You do not work in my trauma bay," Dr. Ashford said, and now his voice carried the edge of something darker. "You are a nurse. A suspended nurse. You will not contradict my clinical judgment. We have a surgeon en route. We wait for qualified personnel. We don't have a surgeon for 22 minutes. Then we wait." The monitor showed a blood pressure of 72/38. The patient's eyes were starting to flutter, the look of someone whose brain was beginning to deprive itself of oxygen. His body was cooling. His skin was the color of ash. Dr. Ashford turned away from her, pulling his phone from his pocket as he moved toward the door. Elena recognized the movement from her weeks of observation. The strategic retreat. The way he was already positioning himself, stepping back from the decision, making space to blame someone else if this went wrong. She watched him gesture toward one of the other attendings in the hallway, watched his lips form words, watched him point back toward the bay with the gesture of a man reassigning responsibility. The general's oxygen saturation dropped to 59%. Elena moved to the crash cart. Her hand knew the way there without instruction. She opened the thoracotomy kit with movements that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone from another life, someone in desert camouflage instead of hospital scrubs. The instruments gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the 14-gauge needle, the antiseptic wipe, the landmarks she could navigate with her eyes closed. "Dr. Ashford," she called out, not loud, not desperate. Just clear. Just the voice of someone stating facts. "If you walk out that door right now, you're choosing your ego over his life." He stopped. His phone was already in his hand. He was already composing the email, already crafting the narrative in his head, the suspended nurse who violated protocols, who acted outside her scope of practice, who caused the death that was going to happen because the cardiothoracic team couldn't arrive in time. He turned back to face her, and his face was flushed the color of arterial blood. "You're suspended, effective immediately," he said, his voice shaking slightly with the rage of a man whose authority was being questioned in front of witnesses. "Security will escort you out of this hospital after this patient is stabilized by qualified personnel. Do not touch that patient. Do not touch anything." Then he was gone, pulling the attending physician aside in the hallway, and Elena could see through the glass partition the way Dr. Ashford was repositioning, reassigning, making calls to the medical board while the patient's oxygen saturation hit 55%. The nursing staff stood frozen around the trauma bay. Sophia's eyes were wide. The respiratory therapist's hands had stopped moving. Everyone understood what was happening. Everyone understood that Elena Martinez had just been told not to act while a Marine general died in front of her. The monitor beeped once. Twice. The heart rate was dropping now. The body's final surrender as oxygen deprivation began to shut systems down. Elena picked up the 14-gauge needle with hands that hadn't shaken since Tikrit. She located the second intercostal space on the patient's right side, the midclavicular line, the spot where the needle would release the pressure that was killing him. Her fingers found the landmarks with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in dust storms and dark tents and once, memorably, in a moving Humvee while IED shrapnel rattled the armor plating. The calculation was the same as it had always been: act and face consequences, or stand still and watch someone die. Blood pressure 80/40 and dropping. That's what the monitor screamed at Elena as she stood 3 feet from the stretcher watching the general's chest rise and fall with the shallow, desperate breathing of a man whose lung had collapsed inward like a fist closing around his own heart. The ER had gone quiet in that particular way, not peaceful, but terrified. Waiting. The way a room sounds when everyone knows someone is about to die and nobody has the authority to stop it. Dr. Ashford stood frozen at the medication cart, phone to his ear, his voice tight with the false composure of a man watching his perfect protocols fail. ETA on cardiothoracic. 32 minutes from the university hospital across town. The general had maybe 14. Maybe less. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, but the pressure inside the chest cavity was building, compressing the heart against the sternum, squeezing the life out of a man whose only mistake was being in the wrong place when a delivery truck ran a red light. Elena moved without thinking, the way muscle memory moves when the calculus becomes simple. Act and face consequences, or stand still and watch someone die. She'd made this choice before in dust storms outside Fallujah where the thermometer hit 123 degrees, in a forward operating base outside Tikrit where the walls vibrated with distant mortar fire, in a Humvee rolling through Sanjan Valley where she'd cracked a lance corporal's chest open while IED shrapnel rattled the armor plating. The math never changed. A human body was a machine. Pressure kills machines. Release the pressure or lose the machine. She grabbed the thoracotomy kit without asking permission, the scalpel, the retractors, the tube for drainage, and moved to the general's left side like a glacier, inevitable and unstoppable. Her hands found the landmarks with the precision of a surgeon's GPS, the fourth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact geometry of survival. 12 years since her last field procedure. 12 years since she'd held this kind of power in her fingers. "What are you doing?" Dr. Ashford's voice came sharp, territorial, but Elena was already prepping the skin with antiseptic, her fingers moving through the ritual with the muscle memory of someone for whom this wasn't a violation of scope, it was breathing. Releasing pressure. Her voice was flat, informational, the voice of someone stating facts that did not require argument. "He'll arrest in 90 seconds if I don't." She marked the intercostal space with a surgical marker, and the line appeared on the general's ribs like a map to salvation or ruin. Elena would find out which one in the next 5 minutes. The scalpel went in with the familiar resistance of skin yielding to steel, a sound like tearing silk that made one of the younger residents in the corner turn away. Elena continued, her hand rock steady, making the anterior lateral incision along the marked line with the kind of precision that comes from having done this while bleeding from shrapnel wounds and holding consciousness through sheer spite. She cracked the chest open. That was what they called it in the literature, the sterile language of surgery, but Elena heard it differently, the sound of bone separating, of the body's armor being breached, of her own breath held in her throat because you don't breathe when you're this close to either saving a life or becoming a murderer. The surgical saw went through muscle and cartilage with a dry whisper, and then the retractors went in, spreading the ribs like wings, and the chest cavity opened. There. The lung collapsed like a deflated balloon. Pressure everywhere in the space around it, blood and air mixed together in a fatal stew. The general's heart was working harder with every passing second, the organ visibly compressed against his sternum, working with the desperation of something being slowly strangled. Elena's hands moved. They always did when it mattered. She found the pleural space, inserted the drainage tube with the kind of gentle precision that took years to learn and seconds to execute, and released the pressure. The sound was immediate, a sharp hiss of air and fluid escaping, the decompression happening in real time, the chest cavity finding its proper balance again. Oxygen saturation began climbing almost instantly. 82. 87. 92. The monitor beeped its ascending rhythm like a heartbeat finding its way back from the edge of extinction. The entire ER watched in a silence so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Nurses stood frozen mid-task. Residents stared with the expression of people watching someone walk through a door that was supposed to be locked. A trauma tech dropped her instrument tray, the clatter echoing through the sudden quiet like a gunshot. The general's eyes fluttered open. Just for a moment. Just long enough to lock onto Elena's face, his pupils dilating with recognition or shock or something that lived in the space between them. His lips moved. The words came out as barely a whisper, so faint that Elena almost didn't hear it, except she had learned to hear through chaos and distance and the roar of Black Hawk rotors. Valkyrie. 1 word. 2 syllables. The sound hung in the air between them, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, not her own lung this time, but something deeper, something that had been sealed away for 2 years beneath scrubs and anonymity and the deliberate construction of a woman who didn't exist. Beside the stretcher, 2 Navy corpsmen went rigid. Their heads snapped toward each other, then back to the general, recognition flooding their faces like a light switch being flipped. One of them, younger, scar tissue around his left eye, whispered something to the other. Valkyrie. The word rippled through them like electricity. Then the general's consciousness slipped again, his eyes rolling back, his breathing settling into the steady rhythm of sedation. Elena checked the tube placement one final time, her hands performing the ritual of verification while her mind remained somewhere else entirely, in a place she promised herself never to return. The cardiothoracic surgeon arrived 13 minutes later. His name was Dr. Marcus Webb, and he'd won awards for his field experience in trauma surgery, and when he rushed into the ER bay he was prepared to crack the chest open himself, to perform the procedure that Elena had already completed with the kind of surgical precision that should have been impossible for a nurse with no authority and nothing to lose except the job she'd already lost 12 hours earlier. He stopped. Stared. The chest tube was perfectly placed. The pressure was released. The general's oxygen saturation was stable at 94%. Who? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elena stepped back from the stretcher. Her hands, still steady, still rock solid, moved to her sides. The blood on her gloves was already beginning to dry, a darker shade of red against the latex, evidence of something that never should have happened. She said nothing. The rule about speaking had never been suspended. The rule about silence had only become more important. That was when Dr. Ashford returned, and with him came hospital security and Patricia Chen, the HR director, her face carrying the apologetic expression of someone delivering a sentence that had already been decided before the trial began. Dr. Ashford's eyes were bright with something that looked like triumph, like a man who'd been waiting for his moment and finally seen it arrive. Nurse Martinez performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in direct violation of her scope of practice and my explicit orders to stand down. His voice carried through the ER like a scalpel cutting through tissue, each word precisely placed for maximum damage. I want her badge. Now. Patricia's face was genuinely sorry, but her voice was firm, the voice of someone who had read the termination paperwork 17 times before Elena even picked up the chest tube. The papers had been prepared at 11:45 the previous evening, printed before the procedure was complete, her firing already decreed by people who made decisions in conference rooms and board meetings rather than operating theaters. Elena followed them to the Human Resources office without protest, her hand still stained with the general's blood, her scrub still damp with the fluid of his survival. The ER staff watched her go. Several of the younger nurses were crying. Sophia, her 12-year-old daughter who had been visiting during the suspension, wasn't in the lobby anymore. Someone had taken her to the break room, shielded her from the sight of her mother being escorted out like a criminal. The office was beige and fluorescent, the kind of room designed to strip humanity out of conversations. Patricia sat behind a desk with a manila folder containing all of Elena's hiring documents, her performance reviews, and now her termination papers. Dr. Ashford stood by the door like a guard, his arms crossed, his expression bearing the satisfaction of a man who'd finally found a legitimate reason to do what he'd wanted to do since the moment Elena had quietly corrected his medication dosing in front of 3 other residents. Unauthorized procedure. Scope violation. Patient endangerment. Dr. Ashford listed the infractions with calculated precision, his voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a script he'd practiced. You performed a thoracotomy without physician authorization, without proper credentials, and without regard for the legal consequences. That's assault on a patient under your care. That's criminal negligence. Elena didn't argue. She didn't explain that the patient would be dead without the procedure. She didn't mention that Dr. Ashford had called for cardiothoracic backup and then vanished into the medication room, paralyzed by protocols that killed people. She didn't mention the faded tattoo she'd glimpsed on the general's shoulder during the procedure, the 2nd Battalion insignia, worn and bleached by sun, matching the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd carried through 3 deployments and 2 Purple Hearts and 1 Bronze Star that she'd never talked about because talking about it meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking the careful architecture of a life spent becoming invisible. She signed the termination papers with the same steady hand that had just saved a life. The pen felt heavier than it should have. The signature looked like it came from someone else. By 9 o'clock that evening, Elena was standing at a rain-soaked bus stop on the corner of 5th and Harbour, holding a cardboard box that someone from the ER had packed for her. The box contained a cracked mug from the staff room, "World's Okayest Nurse" printed in fading letters, a dying succulent that Elena had nursed for 18 months, and the photograph from her locker. Her locker. They'd made her clean it out in front of a security guard, removing each artifact of her attempt to be ordinary, to be unremarkable, to be safe. She traced her finger across the photograph. 23 Marines in desert camo, standing in front of a forward operating base just outside Tikrit, the sun behind them turning them all into silhouettes except for their eyes, which caught the light with the brightness of people who didn't yet understand what the next 3 months would take from them. 3 of those faces were circled in faded pencil on the back of the photograph. 3 of them never came home. Elena's finger lingered on the first one, Corporal James Jimmy Reeves, 22 years old, from somewhere in Kansas. The second was Sergeant Miguel Torres, who had married his girlfriend 4 days before the deployment. The third was another major, ranking above Elena, a woman named Catherine Cox who had caught shrapnel in the same explosion that took Elena's hearing in her left ear and nearly took everything else. She'd spent 2 years not talking about her service. 2 years watching people with less medical knowledge take positions ahead of her. 2 years absorbing insults and humiliation and the particular brand of contempt that comes from being underestimated, being unseen, being treated as less than by someone like Dr. Ashford who had never faced a choice between protocol and survival because he'd never been in a place where protocol meant death. The rain intensified, hammering the bus shelter's roof like applause no one had asked for. Elena stood holding the cardboard box, wondering if she'd ever stop paying the price for being good at keeping people alive. The bus came and went without her boarding. She just stood there, getting soaked, holding the photograph of 3 dead Marines and 17 others who somehow survived Tikrit, and one woman who'd sacrificed everything, her hearing, her career, her identity, to bring them home. She had no idea that in that same hospital, for floors above the empty ER, the general was regaining consciousness. She had no idea that his first word, whispered into the pre-dawn darkness, would be her call sign. She had no idea that a Marine Corps aide was making calls to headquarters, that officers in dress blues were already getting dressed, that her past was about to collide with her present in a way that would bend the entire hospital into a shape it had never been forced to hold. The rain kept falling. Elena kept standing. The cardboard box got heavier. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a show that had already ended. Elena stood at the bus stop with a cardboard box growing heavier by the second, a cracked mug from the ER break room, a dying succulent she'd watered for 3 years, and a photograph of the 2nd Battalion unit, the faces of men and women she'd served with in Tikrit, half of them now reduced to memory and a faded patch sewn inside a jacket lining she wouldn't be wearing anymore. Her suspension papers had arrived by courier at 1847 hours. Her termination notice came at 1903. Dr. Ashford hadn't wasted time. The wheels were already in motion when she'd cracked open that Marine general's chest. She didn't know it yet, but even as she was performing the thoracotomy, even as her hands moved on muscle memory and the ER went dead silent around her, Ashford had already made the phone calls. 3 of them. Board member Sterling Harrison, who owed Ashford 2 decades of professional favors and a $47,000 wedding venue discount. Board member Catherine Pierce, who had appointed Ashford as chief and couldn't afford the optics of his authority being questioned by a floor nurse. And the hospital's chief counsel, Michael Bennett, who would later admit under deposition that Ashford's exact words were, "I need those termination papers filed before she leaves the building." Unauthorized procedures. Scope violation. She's finished. The complaint was already drafted by 1843 hours. 15 minutes before she was escorted to HR. What happened in the conference room at 1915 hours stayed sealed in her memory with the same precision she'd once used to catalogue battlefield casualties, cold, clinical, without judgment. 2 HR representatives, both avoiding her eyes. A thick manila folder with her personnel file, already flagged with yellow stickers. Ashford hadn't attended personally, he was too smart for that. He'd sent Bennett instead, the attorney, which meant this wasn't negotiable. It meant he'd calculated every angle and found her expendable. The termination papers listed 6 violations. 3 were legitimate enough: scope of practice, unauthorized procedure, failure to defer to attending physician. 3 were fabrications. A medication discrepancy from 2019 that had been resolved years ago, reflagged and reassigned to her name. A patient complaint from a visitor whose identity was redacted. A documentation error in a file she didn't recognize. Ashford had spent months building this. She'd spent for minutes stopping a man from dying, and that was all it took to give him the justification he needed. Elena had read the papers without speaking. Hadn't asked questions. Hadn't argued. The personnel manager, Linda Gomez, had actually apologized, her voice shaking. "This isn't. I'm sorry. The decision came from above me. The board met this morning." Elena understood immediately. They'd been waiting. Waiting for any incident to justify what Ashford had already decided the moment she'd corrected him in the supply closet. She'd been allowed to collect her belongings with a security escort. 37 minutes to empty the locker she'd occupied for 5 years. The security guard, a soft-spoken man named James, had stood by the door and said, "I know you saved that general. Everybody's talking about it." Elena had only nodded. There was no answer to that kind of symmetry. She saves a life, loses her career in the same hour. Now, at the bus stop in San Diego's evening rain, the box in her hands felt like the entire weight of her reinvention collapsing inward. She'd moved to Seattle General specifically to disappear. A civilian life. A quiet life. A place where her military service didn't precede her, didn't define her, didn't make her a liability to administrators who preferred their nurses to have no history beyond the hospital walls. She'd been doing everything right. Perfect evaluations. Commendations from patients. Zero disciplinary issues until Ashford decided they needed her gone. The bus pulled up at 19:27 hours. Elena stepped on, paid her fare, and sat by the window with the cardboard box on her lap. The photograph inside showed her in dress blues, 2nd Battalion patch on her sleeve, her arm around a young lieutenant named Torres who'd been killed 3 weeks later in an ambush near Fallujah. She'd never told anyone at the hospital about Torres. She'd never told them about any of it. She'd wanted so badly to be just a nurse. Her phone stayed dark through the evening. No messages from co-workers, they'd been warned, probably. No calls from friends, she didn't have any, not really. She'd kept them all at careful distance. By 2200 hours she was sitting in her apartment, a rental she could no longer afford, and the cardboard box was on the kitchen table beside an empty coffee mug. She had 34 days of savings left. Maybe 40 if she cut everything. Rent was due in 19 days. The next morning, she woke at 0530 hours out of habit, muscle memory, a 2-decade practice of military time that wouldn't leave her even if she'd wanted it to. For 30 minutes she lay in the darkness and made a decision: she would find work at another hospital. San Diego had 7 major medical centers. She had letters of commendation in a drawer. She had 5 years of solid employment history. One termination wouldn't destroy her. It was 08 for 7 hours when her phone buzzed. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Her heart rate accelerated, adrenaline spike, breathing controlled, no physical reaction. She read the messages once, then again to make sure the words stayed the same. "Elena, this is Marcus Chen from the ER. Get to the hospital. Something's happening with the general. They're looking for someone called Valkyrie." "That you?" "There's military people here. Lots of them. They're asking about you." "Where are you?" The 4th message had a photo. Blurry, taken from a distance, but unmistakable, 2 Marines in dress uniform standing in Seattle General's main lobby, their bearing so precisely military that even through poor pixels you could feel the weight of their authority. United States Marine Corps Public Affairs Office. The seal on their uniforms was crisp enough to cut with. Elena's hands didn't shake. She'd trained them not to. She was dressed in 19 minutes, jeans, a black t-shirt, the jacket she wore on bad days when she needed to remember who she'd been. The unit patch was still there inside the lining, where it had been since she'd sewn it the day she was medically discharged. She didn't touch it. She never touched it. It was enough to know it was there, a faded ghost of 2nd Battalion sewn into every civilian identity she'd tried to build. The hospital parking lot was the same as it always was, except it wasn't. There was a black Chevrolet Tahoe in the executive parking section with USMC stamped on a placard. She could see it from her car. She could feel it the same way she'd learned to feel incoming fire in Tikrit, not because she could hear it, but because the air pressure changed, the world tilted slightly on its axis, and everything shifted into combat mode. She parked and walked toward the main entrance. 3 people noticed her immediately, 2 nurses from the night shift, both texting. A security guard doing a double take. She kept moving, her pace even, her breathing controlled. Just a civilian. Just a woman in dark clothes walking into her old workplace. The lobby was impossible to miss. There was a 12-year-old girl sitting on one of the plastic chairs, olive-toned skin, Elena's eyes, Elena's nervous habit of picking at her thumbnail. Sophia. Her daughter was supposed to be in school. Behind Sophia stood a Marine officer, dress uniform so pressed it looked laminated, and next to him stood a Navy medical officer Elena recognized from the ER photos, Captain James Holloway, the man who'd scrubbed in on the general's arrival. Sophia saw her first. Her voice was small and confused and exactly the thing that could break Elena's composure if Elena let it. Mom. Why are they calling you Major? Elena kept walking. Kept her face absolutely still. Kept the mask in place because removing it here, now, with military witnesses and her daughter watching, would mean everything she'd built meant nothing. She was maybe 8 feet away when Captain Holloway turned, saw her, and his entire bearing shifted into something that resembled respect bordering on reverence. Major Martinez. His voice was courtroom quiet. Formal. The kind of formal that acknowledged rank and service and things that transcended civilian chain of command. The general regained consciousness at 0621 hours this morning. His first coherent word was your call sign. Elena stopped. She didn't nod. She didn't acknowledge. She was waiting for the next sentence, the one that would tell her if this was salvation or some new variation of the disaster she'd been running from. He said, "Find Valkyrie. Tell her the bird's flying." Those were his exact words. The bird's flying. That was 2nd Battalion's recovery code. That was what you said when someone was coming home. That was what Torres's commanding officer had said to Elena, standing over his body in the medical tent at FOB Shank, his voice steady, the bird's flying. We're bringing him home. Elena felt her breath change. Still controlled. Still measured. But something inside her cracked, not visibly, not audibly, but the way armor fractures when it's been carrying something too heavy for too long. The general's aide provided us with the medical assessment, Captain Holloway continued, and Elena realized he was speaking slowly, deliberately, giving her time to process words that were rearranging everything. The thoracotomy was textbook combat medicine. Completely necessary given the timeline. The generals fully documented the procedure and requested that the hospital board be informed of the circumstances. Behind him, a woman in a business suit, Elena recognized her as the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Patel, stepped forward with a manila folder that was inexplicably thicker than the termination folder had been. Major Martinez, there's been a significant development in the internal investigation. We need to talk to you about Dr. Ashford's personnel file. The next voice that cut through the lobby was her daughter's, standing up from the plastic chair, her face shifting from confusion to something approaching anger. He got you fired. The guy from before. The doctor who was mean. Sophia's voice was 12 years old and absolutely certain of this truth. How is that fair? Elena finally moved. She walked to Sophia and placed one hand on her daughter's shoulder, the only physical contact she allowed herself in public, the only break in protocol. Sophia immediately leaned into it, understanding without words that something had just changed. Something had finally, irreversibly shifted. It's not, Elena said. Her voice was different now. Lower. Steadier. The voice she'd used to give orders to combat medics in Tikrit. But it's about to be corrected. The investigation that had been weaponized against her didn't just reverse, it pivoted with the precision of poetic justice. The Marine Corps Public Affairs Office didn't make casual hospital visits. They didn't fly 2 officers out for commendation ceremonies without documentation. They didn't validate combat medical procedures without official records. Which meant the hospital's board, already nervous about media scrutiny and donor relations, suddenly faced a choice: stand by the chief physician who'd fired a decorated veteran and a Marine general savior, or distance themselves with surgical speed. Dr. Ashford was in his office at 0930 hours when he learned the general had specifically identified Elena as his physician and requested her commendation. He was still processing that when the hospital's chief counsel informed him that the internal affairs investigation, initially focused on Elena's scope violation, had expanded to include a comprehensive audit of the emergency department. His personnel file was being reviewed. His historical documentation was being verified. His peer reviews were being cross-referenced with other staff physicians' records. By 11:47 hours, hospital security had discovered that the medication discrepancy attributed to Elena in 2019 had been altered. The original documentation showed different timing and different staff signatures than the copy in Ashford's complaint. The original file was still in the archived system. The signatures didn't match. Someone had changed it. By 1300 hours, a nurse named Marcus Chen came forward with handwritten medication logs that contradicted Ashford's official reports. He documented 8 instances where Ashford blamed nursing staff for discrepancies that Marcus had personally witnessed Ashford creating. Marcus had kept copies. He'd been afraid to report it. Elena's thoracotomy, Elena's vindication, had given him permission to be brave. By 1430 hours, Dr. Patel, the same physician Ashford had sabotaged in a peer review, produced a series of emails showing exactly how he'd rewritten her evaluation, tanking her promotion prospects because she'd questioned his management of a sepsis patient. The emails were dated, time-stamped. Utterly damning. The hospital's attorney discovered that Ashford had manipulated patient outcomes data in quarterly reports, reassigning his own medication errors and surgical delays to nursing staff who had no institutional power to fight back. 7 years of documentation. 7 years of calculated deceptions. 7 years of exploiting the power differential between physicians and nurses to build a career on the suffering of people who were too afraid to speak. The instrument of destruction he'd built, authority weaponized against the vulnerable, didn't crumble. It inverted. It turned inward with the precision of a surgical blade. Dr. Richard Ashford was notified of his suspension on Tuesday. By Thursday, his medical license was under review by the California Medical Board. By Friday, he was clearing out his office while nurses who'd once flinched at his voice watched from the hallway, their silence more damning than any accusation they could have made. 6 months later, Elena Martinez returned to Seattle General as the new director of emergency medical services. Her white coat was crisp, and the faded unit patch from 2nd Battalion was sewn inside the lining where it had always belonged. The Marine general, fully recovered, with the kind of scars that tell stories, attended her first day and saluted her in front of the assembled ER staff. The gesture said everything his words could not. The morning Elena walked through the ER as director, she passed Dr. Richard Ashford in a Navy security guard uniform, checking locks on doors he'd once commanded others to open, his medical license revoked after the state board investigation confirmed 7 years of falsified records and ethical violations. He didn't meet her eyes. She didn't need him to. In the break room at 0400 hours, during the quiet shift when the ER settled into its night rhythm, Elena touched the unit patch inside her white coat and thought of the faces in that photograph, the ones who didn't come home, the ones she'd carried out, the ones who whispered her call sign when they woke up alive. She'd spent 2 years running from that identity, believing civilian life required her to be smaller, quieter, less than what Tikrit had forged. But some wars end only when you stop running from who you've always been. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you believe in stories like Elena's, stories of people whose strength gets underestimated, whose service gets forgotten, whose quiet heroism finally gets recognized, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your own story of being underestimated and proving them wrong.